Hello everyone, it is me, Pui. Forgive my appearance. I watched Love Lies Bleeding last night, and yeah, we're gonna be doing some workouts now apparently. But anywho, speaking of pumping, getting ripped, getting some bulk on you, we're gonna talk about a deck building concept today that I think a lot of people don't think about. I'm going to start off with a story. Before getting into GOAT format, once in a while, I would just kind of check in on Yu-Gi-Oh! I was quite aware of what a metagame was, and the concept, meta decks existing, tier decks existing, but personally, I was just coming in as a tourist. I really didn't care about the tier decks. I didn't pay any attention. I had no idea it was meta, no idea it was good, except for basically in retrospect and whatever deck I saw the most. So there were times when I was getting smacked by Mermail. There were times when I was being smacked by Zodiac. There are times I was being smacked by Infernoble. There was one deck I kept playing over and over again. It got worse over time, but this deck was called 3-Shot. Now, if you don't know, and you probably don't know, one of my favorite cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is Volcanic Scattershot, specifically because of this deck. I think the card is hilarious. I think having a once per game blow up the whole board and deal 1,500 damage is really, really funny. And it's even funnier when they created Blaze Accelerator Reload. You can banish it from your graveyard at as a quick effect to do Scattershot whenever you want. So this deck was playing 3 copies of Foolish Burial Rites, 3 copies of Paleozoic Morella, 3 copies of Reload, 3 copies of Scattershot, and then also 3 copies of Jar of Avarice, because Pot of Avarice was long banned at this point, but Jar of Avarice was not. And so what the deck did, in addition to playing a Dino Rabbit engine for some fucking reason, I don't know why, is it would set up the Scattershot disruption over and over again. And it would deal over the course of the game, it would do 3 shots. So you'd get to deal, theoretically, well actually you could have done 4. You could deal up to 6,000 damage and blow up the board each time. The deck sucked. The deck sucked ass. It had 1 negate, and it had a bunch of disruptive destroys. Phoenix Enforcer crying and shitting right now. But the deck only did one thing. That's all it did. If it was disrupted, if I drew too much of the Foolish Burial Goods and the Morella, and I didn't draw any of the Jar of Avarice, nothing. And so that's the concept we're going to talk about today. I call it deck anemia. And it's something that I have noticed on a lot of my older decks, and noticed with a lot of older successful GOAT format decks, and to notice a trend away from them directly correlating with better deck building on everyone's part. So when I say anemia, what do I mean? It's a lack of iron, it's a lack of meat, a lack of substance, a lack of strength. And what it really boils down to, with everything I'm going to talk about boils down to, is that there is a ceiling on how much consistency is good. And there is a direct contention between redundancy/consistency and longevity and recoverability. So in practice, what does this look like? It looks like 3-Shot. The deck could really consistently do its Scattershot thing and really could not do anything besides its Scattershot thing. So right then and there, you see the problem. Now, modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, I don't know how much the concept applies, but for retro formats, absolutely. So for you GOAT and Edison folks, you Tengu folks even, I'd say probably around Fire Water is when it's gonna not apply as much. But all you retro format folks, you listen up here. This applies just as well. Let's take, for example, the Alderso deck, otherwise known as Shane Bird. Both of them made this deck at the same time. I'd say Shane's is an example of a little more meat. So let's start with Alderso's deck, right? If you were around in the days of Alderso terrorizing the ladder, before he picked up Ron Burn, before he picked up Ron Control, he played this deck that was a Dimension Fusion Turbo deck, and it turned into a Burn deck. After talking to me, he flipped it around. I advised him that it should start as a Burn deck and then turn into a Dimension Fusion Turbo deck, because obviously the forms of interaction in a Burn matchup back in those days was way worse, and the ways people would side against Burn made Dimension Fusion Turbo easy pickings afterwards. Looking back at this deck now, it's anemic. If you compare it to other DFT lists, and if you compare it to other Panda Burn lists, it's very clear what I mean. Think about what a Desk Koala and a Dravekeeper Spy do for you, and the amount of situations they're helpful in contrast to a giant rat in the case of Panda Burn, or a Dekoichi in the case of DFT. You're fundamentally taking out these cards that, while they seem like they work better for this flow of the plan, they relegate you to a single plan. You know, these other DFT decks are playing Dark Magician of Chaos, they're playing Jinzo, they're playing that one of Lightning Vortex. These cards seem weird, These cards can be things you brick on, but it's much more likely you're going to brick on drawing the second, giant Trunade, the second dimension fusion. So if you're not playing those cards of substance, something's missing. You're going to be fundamentally drawing the same type of piece for the same type of situation, and if that situation's not what you need to answer right now, you are dead. Another example of this, I'd say, is my Ron control deck I recently topped with. Now, I hate to be throwing Alderso under the bus here, I do. He's an amazing deck builder, he really thought of some amazing concepts, but his version of Ron Control, which I'll be talking about in my next Ron Control tutorial video as well, is another example of this, and how I changed it into Ron Control. If you contrast the utility value of playing additional Book of Tayus, obviously it makes it easier to do the Ron bow. You can activate Tayu on Seejar more often if you have more Tayus, and you can do it multiple times a game, and that can be your plan, and you can win. If you draw 2 Book of Tayu and you don't have Seejar, you're gonna die. So contrast that with a deck that instead of playing that second Tayu is playing, 2 Creature Swap. Creature Swap even can have that same problem, but it works better in more situations. It works with your scapegoats better. The same concept goes, instead of playing Mystic Tomato, the control deck I was playing is playing Abyss Soldier, DD Warrior Lady. Mystic Tomato gets you to your jar, but if Mystic Tomato is a card that can be answered, then having 2 Mystic Tomatoes in hand it's poor, it's bad. Versus having an Abyss Soldier and a Sinister Serpent, gonna be a lot better. So how does this apply to your deck building? I mean, obviously, if you look at these examples, you can have this idea that when people are playing these Chaos Turbo decks with their 1 Book of Moon, their 1 Tsukiyomi, their 1 Dust Shoot, or even if you look at a pile deck and why they were called piles, you might be thinking, what drugs were they on? But actually, there is some utility in doing so, having these cards. And I think the best way to really think about it is, I think we've all had that moment where we tried to build the mega consistent deck, the thin, only thinning, all thinning deck. It's possible in GOATS if you think about it. I built a deck recently that really exemplified the concept. It didn't even make it off the page, really. It was playing Manju Zork Engine. It was playing Toon Cannon with the Toon Tables, 3 Jar of Greeds, Upstart Goblin. I've seen a version that was like Dragon Turbo. It was trying to do Thunder Dragon, and then it would also use a bunch of stuff to discard dragons with card destruction, and then you would play Super Rejuve, or you can play Reckless Greed with it. Just all these decks where you're actually just trying to draw the most cards. And I mean, I even made fun of this in my very interesting Christmas video. They're bad, because at the end of the day, what cards are you drawing? You only have so many. So if you have this extra random Book of Moon, I mean, Book of Moon might not be the best card for a situation, but it is another card that handles a situation, in contrast to 3rd Jar of Greed. A random, Tsukiyomi, there's actual utility to that. And the same goes in Warriors when they play their random Faith. Faith does something so different than what the rest of the Warrior deck does. And having to take into account that different something and how profound an effect it can have on the game is a headache. Even if theoretically, I'm going to save my Nox until the Faith shows up. But if you don't have the Nox, that's a problem. And you can't keep knocking too, even if that Faith is there. And then this same concept got taken further, and we have the Thunderclap decks, the pile decks, and they're just straight up playing Flips and Toolbox Warrior at the same time, because even if you might not have the right tool for the right job, both tools do a lot of jobs. Both can gain you an advantage. So why not just play them both and let your good play handle the rest? And it's the same reason that I'd say, looking back, my original Zork Turbo probably didn't have a lot of legs versus where we are now with the Quish Turbos, looking at what NB did, looking at what Pike Freak did, looking at even what was done between me and Wavement. All my deck was doing was just putting things back on the top of the deck, and eventually it would summon Zork. It had its one trick. And that trick could absolutely kill people, but it's all one trick. Maybe that's the word I'm just looking for here, is one trick. Some people say glass cannon, but fair decks can be one trick and glass cannon in the same way if you're not careful. You can take this concept, and it's not just about whether or not your deck is an unfair deck trying to do one thing or a fair deck, because you can make an unfair deck do multiple things, and not just through a transforming sideboard. Look at my Ron Control. It's exactly that. That deck fundamentally is trying to win unfairly, but plays a full fair game. And you can take a fair deck, and you can bolster it all the way up into something that does a lot of different things. And you can even just throw in 1 or 2 jar of greed so you can get to those things faster, which in the case of a fair deck is the opposite. If you look at the contrast between Earth Aggro and the Florida Man deck, Shaggy's directly telling me, he said to me, because that's how this video started, I was talking to him, that he felt like there was a point where Earth Aggro wouldn't be able to come back anymore, because what Earth Aggro does is put bodies on the field fast and try to hit over. But if the back row is too heavy, or if there's goats in the way, it's going to get to this point where it kind of just gets gummed up. So we added this extra stuff to give it more of a oomph at the end. So in any case, hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you can think of some more examples. Hopefully it guides your deck building. There's a lot of decks in GOAT format that I think could be helped by this thinking. I mean, if you even compare Delinquent's Decree Zombies to Alefia's later Decree Zombies, you can see the same thing, that he made changes that added more meat. You could probably do it with Benkei. You could maybe do it with Library if you're crazy, but also please don't. You can do it with Zombies probably multiple times over. Gonna do it with Ron Control further. Can do it with Monarchs, absolutely. I think Monarchs are still quite underexplored, but there's a lot of ways that if you are smart, you can be adding meat to these old bones. So, what deck's gonna be made next? I'm quite curious, and hopefully this inspires you to find out. But for now, I've been Pui, and I hope you have a lovely day.